Most people think medieval guilds were about craftsmanship, about pride in work, about artisans protecting quality in a rough pre-industrial world. That's the image we inherited. It's comforting, orderly, almost wholesome. But it's incomplete, because guilds didn't just protect craft, they controlled markets. They decided how much you could charge, how much you could earn, who could work, and who never would. They fixed prices, kept wages, restricted entry, and quietly shaped the flow of money in entire cities, often with more precision than kings ever managed. This wasn't a side effect of medieval life, it was the system. Welcome to the Financial Historian Files, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand guilds properly, you have to place yourself in medieval Europe, between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries. Cities were growing again after centuries of fragmentation, trade was expanding, coinage was returning to everyday life, but central authority was weak. Kings ruled in name more than in practice. Law enforcement was inconsistent. Markets were volatile, and trust was fragile. In that environment, something had to impose order. Guilds emerged as legally recognized associations of people practicing the same trade. Bakers, weavers, masons, goldsmiths, carpenters. They were granted charters by city councils or monarchs, giving them monopoly rights over production and sale within city walls. In exchange, they promised stability, standardized quality, predictable prices, trained labor, and social support for members. And at first, this worked. Guilds solved real problems. They ensured bread wasn't adulterated. They enforced weights and measures. They trained apprentices in skills that took years to master. They cared for widows, paid funeral costs, and supported members during illness. In a world without modern insurance or regulation, guilds created trust. That's the part often remembered. What's forgotten is what happened once trust turned into power. Because guilds were not workers' unions in any modern sense. They didn't exist to represent labor against capital. In fact, they did the opposite. Guilds were dominated by masters, shop owners, not apprentices or journeymen. The people who set the rules were the ones who already owned tools, workshops, and political influence. Labor didn't negotiate with guilds. Labor answered to them. Once a guild controlled a trade, it controlled prices openly and explicitly. Price lists were posted. Undercutting was illegal. Selling outside approved channels brought fines, confiscation, or expulsion. The justification was stability. The effect was cartelization. Take Florence, one of the richest cities in medieval Europe. Its wool industry was dominated by the Arte della Lana, one of the most powerful guilds in the city. It dictated who could produce cloth, what quality standards applied, how much wool could be processed, and at what prices finished goods could be sold. Florence's wealth didn't come from free competition, it came from controlled production at scale. The Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths in London did something similar. They regulated purity, pricing, and access to precious metals. Quality control mattered, yes, but so did preventing outsiders from competing. Monopoly and legitimacy traveled together. Bread guilds across Europe fixed prices for staple foods. On paper, this protected consumers from gouging. In practice, it stabilized profits for bakers and transferred risk elsewhere to grain suppliers, laborers, and anyone outside the guild's protection. And then there were wages. Guilds did not fight to raise wages for workers, they fixed them. Apprentices were bound for years, sometimes a decade or more, working long hours for little or no pay in exchange for training and the possibility of advancement. Journeymen were paid standardized wages with little room for negotiation. Opening your own shop required approval, fees, citizenship, and often family connections. Skill alone was not enough. You could be excellent at your craft and still be locked out of ownership for life because permission mattered more than talent. Entry barriers were deliberate. Apprenticeship fees rose over time. Training periods lengthened. Membership requirements became stricter. Many guilds excluded women, migrants, religious minorities, and rural workers entirely, not because of explicit malice, but because restriction preserved income for those already inside. This is the critical point. Guilds did not become restrictive because they were corrupt in a moral sense. They became restrictive because monopoly power rewards limitation. Once access is controlled, competition becomes the threat, not exploitation, and guilds didn't just control markets, they shaped politics. Guild leaders sat on city councils. They financed public works. They loaned money to governments. In cities like Florence, political office was often tied directly to guild membership. Economic power and civic authority fused quietly behind procedures and charters. Before central banks, guilds were part of the financial system. This created a peculiar stability. Prices didn't swing wildly, production followed predictable rhythms. Social unrest was managed through inclusion if you were inside the guild, and exclusion if you weren't. Order was maintained, mobility was sacrificed, and that trade-off lasted for centuries. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because nothing about this is uniquely medieval. What guilds reveal is a recurring pattern in economic history. Institutions built to protect against chaos tend over time to protect incumbents against change. Regulation begins as coordination. Coordination hardens into control. Control eventually becomes invisible because it's legal, procedural, and normalized. No swords required. The medieval craftsman needed permission to work. The modern worker needs credentials, licenses, compliance, and capital. The language changed. The logic didn't. Guilds didn't fail because they were evil. They succeeded because they solved problems and then refused to relinquish the power that solution created. They didn't invent inequality. They institutionalized it. And once you see that, it reframes how you think about prices, wages, and money, not as natural outcomes of skill or effort, but as negotiated results inside systems that decide who gets access and who doesn't. Guilds didn't disappear. They evolved. When medieval Europe began to fracture under the pressure of new ideas, new trade routes, and new technologies, guilds didn't collapse overnight. They resisted. They adapted. And when they finally lost their formal monopolies, their logic survived, embedded quietly into modern economic life. Because what guilds perfected wasn't medieval craftsmanship. It was control over access. As nation-states grew stronger in the early modern period, kings and parliaments began dismantling guild privileges, at least on paper. Free trade became the slogan. Competition was praised. Markets were supposed to open. But the reality was more complicated. Guilds lost their charters, yet their functions migrated. Professional licensing replaced guild membership. Credentials replaced apprenticeships. Regulatory boards replaced guild councils. The gatekeepers changed uniforms, not incentives. And once again, the justification sounded reasonable. Standards protect consumers. Licensing ensures quality. Regulation prevents chaos. All of that can be true and still incomplete. Because just like medieval guilds, modern gatekeeping systems don't just regulate quality, they regulate who is allowed to compete. The medieval mason needed permission to build inside city walls. The modern professional needs certification, accreditation, compliance, capital, and time, often years of it, before earning the right to participate. None of this looks like exclusion. It looks like process. And that's what makes it so effective. Wages, too, followed the same trajectory. In medieval cities, wages weren't negotiated freely. They were standardized, stabilized, and capped, not to empower workers, but to preserve order and predictability for those at the top. Today, wage suppression rarely comes from open price fixing. It comes from credential inflation, outsourcing, non-compete clauses, platform dependency, and labor segmentation. The mechanism is different. The outcome is familiar. Stability for insiders, friction for everyone else. This is why guild logic keeps resurfacing whenever markets mature. Young, chaotic markets reward innovation. Mature markets reward protection. Over time, the people who win aren't the most skilled. They're the ones closest to rulemaking. And when those rules become complex enough, they stop looking like power. They look like common sense. This is also why inflation and inequality often rise together. When access is restricted, competition weakens. When competition weakens, prices become sticky on the way down and flexible on the way up. Costs get passed downstream, wages lag, profits concentrate, and the system insists it's functioning as designed. Because, in a way, it is. Guilds understood this centuries ago. They didn't need to exploit overtly. They didn't need violence. They needed legitimacy. Once their rules were recognized by the state, their control became invisible. Market outcomes looked natural. Failure looked personal. If you couldn't earn more, it wasn't the system, it was you. That psychological shift might be the guild's most enduring legacy. Because once people internalize barriers as personal shortcomings, power doesn't need to justify itself anymore. This is where financial education becomes uncomfortable and necessary. Most people are taught to think about money in terms of effort, work harder, learn skills, improve productivity. Those things matter, but they are not the full picture. They never were. Real wealth formation has always depended on access, to markets, to capital, to networks, to permission. Guilds made that explicit. Modern systems disguise it. And here's the final grounding truth you should take from the story. Guilds were not villains. They were not heroes. They were institutions responding rationally to incentives. They solved problems. Then they protected their solutions. Then they protected themselves. That's not medieval behavior. That's human behavior. History doesn't repeat, but it does reveal patterns. And the pattern guilds expose is this. When economic order becomes rigid, mobility dies quietly, not with revolutions, but with paperwork. Understanding that doesn't mean rejecting regulation or standards. It means recognizing where power actually lives and where it quietly decides who gets to build real wealth and who never will. Because once you see the system, you stop blaming yourself for outcomes it was never designed to allow. And that's where real financial freedom begins. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.